They said I abandoned my family, that I turned my back on our roots, our land, and worst of all, on them. For years I stayed away. Not a phone call, not a visit, nothing. Until the day my sister stood trembling in court, about to lose her child. The judge looked past her and stared directly at me. His voice shook the room when he said, "Is that Governor Adams?" Suddenly, every whisper I ever ignored turned into stunned silence. And in that silence, I finally found my voice. Have you ever been told you failed only to rise higher than anyone expected? If this story resonates with you, show some love. Like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more powerful tales of karma, redemption, and unexpected triumphs. My name is Rebecca Adams, and if you ask anyone in my hometown, they'll probably still tell you I'm a disgrace. I grew up in a small, dusty farming town in Iowa, where your last name meant more than your dreams. My family owned one of the oldest corn farms in the county. Generations worked that soil with their bare hands, sunburnt shoulders, and blistered knuckles. Tradition wasn't just respected, it was enforced. My father, Howard Adams, believed hard work and obedience were the only paths to worth. My mother, a woman of few words and fewer opinions, spent most of her days in silence tending the garden and watching the world from the kitchen window. And then there was Julia, my baby sister. Sweet, soft-hearted Julia, with curls like our mama's and eyes that always saw the best in people. Growing up, I was the odd one out. I didn't want to marry a local boy, raise kids on the land, and spend my life harvesting corn. I wanted more, not because I thought I was better, but because I dreamed bigger. While other girls my age were learning to preserve peaches or sew curtains, I was reading biographies of women in power. Eleanor Roosevelt, Shirley Chisholm, Madeleine Albright. I remember whispering once to Julia, one day I'm going to be on TV, not for marrying someone famous, but for being someone powerful. She believed me. She always did. But no one else did. When I got accepted into a political science program out of state, I was over the moon. I thought my parents would finally be proud. Instead, my father refused to speak to me for weeks. My mother said quietly over dinner, "Rebecca, we don't do that here." As if chasing your calling was a sin, as if wanting something different was a betrayal. So at 20, I packed my bags, kissed Julia goodbye in the barn, and walked away from everything I knew. No dramatic goodbyes, no tears from my father, just silence and the sound of gravel crunching under my car tires. I never went back. Over the next two decades, I built a life for myself, one brick at a time. I interned with state senators, slept in tiny studio apartments, ate ramen more nights than I care to admit. But I kept going. I kept believing that I could make a difference. Eventually, the sacrifices paid off. I became a state representative, then a senator, and finally, against all odds, I was elected as the governor of my state. But even as headlines flashed my name and networks debated my policies, not a single call came from home. No congratulations. No, we're proud of you. I was still the girl who left the farm, the traitor. I didn't try to change their minds. I told myself I didn't need their approval. I had my mission. I had my people. But every time I saw Julia's name pop up on social media, every time I saw pictures of her with her son Liam, I felt that ache, the ache of missing the only person who never made me feel like I didn't belong. I knew she'd gotten married young to a man who promised more than he delivered. I knew he left when Liam was just a toddler, and I knew she worked 2 jobs just to scrape by. But I also knew better than to insert myself. My family had made it clear I wasn't welcome in their world anymore. So I watched from afar. Until one day, a news article came across my desk. A small local paper from back home. Just a short piece buried on the 4th page. Single mother faces custody battle amid financial hardship. There was no picture, no name. But I knew it was Julia. My hands trembled. All the power I had, every bill I'd signed, every room I'd commanded suddenly felt useless, because the one person I loved most might lose the one thing she lived for, and no one had told me. No one had let me help. It wasn't politics that kept me away all those years. It was pride, theirs and mine. But in that moment, reading those cold black letters on paper, none of that mattered anymore. I made a call, not as Governor Adams, but as Julia's sister. I didn't expect a warm welcome. I didn't expect hugs or tears or even a thank you. But I thought maybe, just maybe, someone in my family would answer the phone when I called. No one did. I left voicemails, texted, even reached out to our old neighbor, Mrs. Lorne, who still baked pies for church on Sundays. She told me in her sweet but cautious voice, "Rebecca, honey, they don't talk about you much. Your daddy said you're off in the clouds now. Thinks you'd rather serve strangers than help your own blood." That stung more than I wanted to admit. I wasn't trying to be a savior. I just wanted to be there for Julia. I didn't care about the family name or what they thought about me running a government instead of a tractor. But I did care about that little boy, about the sister who used to braid my hair and sneak me cookies when I cried in the hayloft. So I decided to go back, quietly. I didn't announce anything. No staff, no media. I wore a plain blouse and jeans, tied my hair back, and drove myself to that courthouse in the middle of the town I once called home. The courthouse hadn't changed. The peeling paint, the old clock that always ran 5 minutes slow. Even the benches creaked the same way when I sat down. Julia was already inside the courtroom when I slipped into the back row. Her shoulders were hunched, her hair pulled into a messy bun. She looked exhausted, thinner than I remembered. She clutched a folder like it held her whole world. Maybe it did. Her ex-husband, Travis, stood across from her, clean-shaven, smug, and flanked by a lawyer in a crisp navy suit. I didn't know much about him, but I knew he'd disappeared when Liam was still in diapers and suddenly reappeared, claiming Julia was unfit to raise their son alone. Unfit. The word made my blood boil. Julia had worked night shifts and still made it to every school event. She clipped coupons, skipped meals, and never once asked for help. And that was what made her unfit. Because she didn't have enough money. Because she didn't smile enough anymore. The judge, a man in his early 60s with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, reviewed the papers silently while the lawyers bickered over visitation rights and primary residence. It was painful to watch. And then came the comment that snapped the air out of the room. Travis's lawyer stood up smug and confident and said, "Your Honor, the child would be better served in a stable home. Ms. Adams clearly lacks support from her family, financial or otherwise. In fact, not a single member of her family is here to advocate for her. Doesn't that say enough?" I could feel Julia flinch. And in that second, I stood up. The wooden bench groaned as I rose. My heart pounded, but my voice was steady. "Excuse me, Your Honor," I said. Heads turned. Julia froze. Travis's lawyer blinked, like he'd just seen a ghost. The judge squinted confused until his eyes widened just slightly. "Miss Adams?" he asked slowly. I walked forward, hands clasped politely in front of me. "My name is Rebecca Adams," I said clearly. "Julia's sister." The judge looked at me again, this time deeper. Something shifted in his expression. Recognition, disbelief, and a little awe. After a pause, he said with a voice that filled the courtroom. Governor Adams' gasps rippled across the room. Even the court reporter dropped her pen. Travis looked like he'd swallowed a bug. Julia just stared at me, eyes wide and wet. I nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor." A silence fell, the kind that bends time. No one knew what to say. The judge recovered first. "Well, that changes things." He invited me to sit beside Julia. I did. She didn't speak. Not yet. But I felt her hand trembling slightly in her lap. I placed mine over hers and gave it a gentle squeeze. For the rest of the hearing, I didn't speak unless spoken to. I didn't throw my title around or try to bulldoze the process. I simply sat beside my sister, where I should have been all along, and still, not one member of my family showed up. After the hearing, Julia and I sat in her old pickup truck for a while. The late autumn wind howled through the cracks in the window. She stared straight ahead for a long time, before whispering, "You came." "I always would have," I said quietly. "You just never asked." She laughed bitterly through tears. "They told me not to, said you were too busy, too important, said you didn't care." I shook my head slowly. I left because they never believed in me, but I never stopped believing in you. That was the moment the dam broke. She cried into my shoulder, just like when we were kids, and I held her tighter than I ever had before. It didn't erase the years. It didn't fix everything, but it cracked something open. Something that had been locked away for too long. And through that crack, hope began to pour in. That night, I stayed in a tiny roadside motel just outside of town, the kind with flickering neon signs and vending machines that only take quarters. It wasn't about comfort. It was about staying close in case Julia needed me. I lay awake for hours, staring at the stained ceiling tiles, listening to the hum of the old air conditioner. My mind spun with memories, my father's cold stare, as I left home, the way my mother clutched her apron, but said nothing, the silence from my family even after I became governor. Years of rejection, of being too much for a place that never wanted me to be more than someone's wife or someone's shadow. But what haunted me most wasn't the past. It was Julia's face in that courtroom, how broken she looked before she saw me, and how fragile her smile had been after. She had no one, no safety net, no family showing up at her door, with casseroles and warm hugs. Just me. And now, that had to be enough. The next morning, I met her at the diner before her shift. She worked there part-time, waiting tables between shifts at the local library. She was wearing the same scuffed sneakers from high school and a name tag with fading ink. She smiled when she saw me, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. We ordered coffee. Cheap, watery, comfort-in-a-cup coffee. "Are you really staying?" she asked softly. "As long as you need me," I said. She nodded, biting her lip. "It's not just Travis. It's the whole system. I can't afford daycare. Liam's school keeps threatening to report me because I'm always 5 minutes late. I'm drowning Becca. She hadn't called me that in years. I reached across the table and took her hand. Then we swim together. It sounded simple, hopeful, but I knew the fight ahead would be anything but. Later that week, the custody hearing resumed. This time, Travis's lawyer came in with a thick folder of supposed evidence. Financial records showing Julia's income barely met minimum living standards. Photos of her modest two-bedroom apartment with peeling paint and an old space heater. Even a testimony from one of her supervisors complaining that she had too many personal emergencies to be reliable. It was brutal. Julia sat beside me, silent, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She just took it, blow after blow, as if she believed every word was true. Then Travis stood up and spoke directly to the court. Your Honor, I'm not trying to take my son away out of spite. I just want what's best for him, a stable home, a father who can provide. I almost stood to object. You mean the father who disappeared for 5 years, the one who never sent a dime, but I bit my tongue. The judge needed facts, not fury. Then came the bombshell. Your Honor. Travis's lawyer said smoothly, we'd also like to introduce a sworn statement from Julia's parents, Howard and Marlene Adams, affirming that they do not believe Julia is fit to raise Liam without supervision. The room spun. I turned sharply toward Julia. She looked stunned. No, she whispered. They wouldn't, but they had. The document was entered into evidence. Their words, cold, formal, and devastating, filled the air. While we love our daughter, Julia has always struggled with consistency. She refuses help even when offered. We believe temporary custody with the father is in the child's best interest, not a single mention of their failure to offer real help. Not a word about their absence in her life or their blatant refusal to support her emotionally, let alone financially. The betrayal hit like a punch to the chest. Julia crumpled. Not physically, but emotionally. I could feel it, the final thread snapping inside her. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even angry. She just sat there hollowed out. I leaned in and whispered, "Look at me." She didn't. "Julia," I said more firmly, "look at me." Finally, her eyes met mine. Wet red broken. You are not what they say. You are not what he says. You are not alone. She nodded slowly, but the light inside her seemed dimmed. The judge called for a recess. I stood marched out of the courtroom, and for the first time in a very long while I shook. Not because I was afraid, but because I was angry. Not just at Travis, not just at my parents, but at every smug little man who ever thought they could steamroll a woman just because she was tired, single, and struggling. At every system that punishes resilience and rewards abandoners. I had spent my career writing policy. Now it was time to live it. I made a call, not to my staff, but to the founder of a nonprofit I had helped fund a year ago, a program aimed at supporting single mothers in rural communities. They were piloting in a neighboring state. I asked if they could expand fast. Then I called a journalist I trusted, one who didn't twist stories for clicks. And finally, I called a lawyer. A damn good one. Not for me, for Julia. Because this wasn't just about one custody battle anymore. It was about rewriting the entire narrative. The next day, the courtroom felt different. Maybe it was the air heavy with tension, or maybe it was the fact that the gallery seats, usually half empty, were suddenly packed. People murmured quietly. Local journalists scribbled in notebooks. Julia sat beside me in a freshly pressed blouse and pulled back hair, trying to hide the tremble in her hands. Travis stood a little straighter than usual. His lawyer, sensing something had shifted, kept glancing over his shoulder toward the door. Then the judge walked in. All rise. Everyone stood, but just before the judge took her seat, she paused and looked directly at me. Her expression softened just slightly before she spoke. I'd like to recognize the presence of a distinguished guest in our courtroom today, Governor Rebecca Adams. The room fell silent. You could hear the sound of jaws dropping, including Julia's. Travis's lawyer nearly dropped his pen. The judge nodded in my direction, her tone professional but unmistakably warm. It's not often we have state leadership attend family court proceedings. Thank you for being here. I stood slowly, gave a small nod. It's an honor to support my sister. My sister. It was the first time I'd said those words publicly in over a decade. Julia looked at me, her mouth slightly open. She looked like she was breathing for the first time in weeks. The judge resumed her seat, her eyes scanning the room. Let's continue. Travis's lawyer stood noticeably less confident than before. But now it was our turn. The lawyer I had brought, in a woman named Camille Monroe, fierce and sharp as a blade, rose smoothly from her seat. Your Honor. Before we proceed, I'd like to request the court's permission to enter new evidence into the record supporting the fitness, stability, and growth plan for my client, Ms. Julia Adams. Travis's lawyer objected. Your Honor, this is irregular. We weren't informed. But the judge held up a hand. You may proceed, Ms. Monroe. Camille opened a leather-bound folder and began distributing documents to the bench to opposing counsel, and entered digital copies into the court file. These are signed agreements from 3 nonprofit organizations, 2 local and 1 interstate, providing Julia Adams with comprehensive support over the next 12 months. This includes subsidized childcare job training, legal and emotional counseling, and access to affordable housing if needed. A murmur rippled through the room. Camille continued. In addition, Julia Adams has secured a part-time position as a literacy coordinator at the regional library with a guaranteed path to full-time employment. She paused, letting that sink in. Your Honor, this is not a woman in decline. This is a woman rising. And I believe it's time we stop punishing women for being human and start rewarding them for fighting to stay afloat. The judge sat quietly for a moment, flipping through the documentation. Then she looked at Travis. Do you have any objections? His lawyer stood, but his voice was less certain. We question the sustainability of these resources and whether they've been in place long enough to prove long-term stability. Camille smiled. Then may I call a witness, Your Honor? The judge nodded, and Camille turned to me. Governor Adams, would you be willing to testify? I felt the entire room shift its weight in my direction. For a second, I felt 17 again, standing in the farmhouse kitchen, trying to explain why I didn't want to be just another quiet girl in a town that didn't want more from me. I heard my father's voice in my head. Don't embarrass this family, Rebecca. But I stepped forward. took the oath, and spoke. My name is Rebecca Adams. I am the current governor of this state. But more importantly, today I am Julia Adams's sister. I looked at Julia. Her eyes glistened. Julia is the strongest woman I know. Not because she hasn't struggled, but because she has, and still shows up for her son every single day. I turned to the judge. When I left home, I thought success meant leaving everyone behind. But I was wrong. It means coming back when it matters most. I paused. Everything you see in that folder, the childcare, the job support, the housing, those aren't handouts. They are tools. Tools we're implementing across this state to ensure single mothers like Julia don't fall through the cracks. The courtroom was quiet. I'm not here as a governor today. I'm here as a witness to Julia's strength, and to ask this court not to punish her for being tired, but to honor her for never giving up. The judge sat back, visibly moved. She glanced at Julia, then at Travis. I will take a short recess to deliberate, she said. The gavel fell. We stood. As the courtroom emptied for recess, Julia turned to me. You did that for me. I shook my head. No, I said softly. You did this for you. I just made sure they listened. She grabbed my hand tightly. I'm sorry, she whispered, for all the years I didn't reach out, for letting them say you abandoned us. I felt my throat tighten. You didn't need to apologize. I didn't leave because I stopped loving this family. I left because I had to become someone strong enough to come back and change it. We sat in silence after that. But this time, it wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. A rare moment of calm before the judgment. And whatever came next, we were facing it together. When the court reconvened after recess, the energy in the room had shifted entirely. Travis looked uncomfortable in his seat, fidgeting with his cuffs. His confidence had slipped through his fingers the moment the judge acknowledged who I was and what I had brought to the table. This wasn't just about Julia anymore. This was about the court's integrity, the system's fairness, and the eyes of the public now glued to this room. The judge returned to the bench, her face composed, but her eyes carried a different weight, one that spoke of both authority and empathy. Having reviewed the submitted documentation, heard the testimonies, and weighed the best interest of the child, she began pausing as the room collectively held its breath. This court rules in favor of Ms. Julia Adams. Julia gasped. The judge continued, her voice unwavering. Custody will remain with the mother. Further, this court commends Ms. Adams for her ongoing efforts to improve her circumstances and serve as a loving, responsible parent. I saw Julia's hand fly to her mouth. Her body trembled as relief surged through her. I placed my hand over hers, steadying her. I could feel her tears landing on our entwined fingers. Across the aisle, Travis stood frozen. His lawyer whispered something into his ear, but he wasn't listening. The expression on his face was priceless. Entitlement shattered by reality. Karma didn't always come in fire and fury. Sometimes it came in the form of a courtroom full of truth. But I wasn't done yet. That night, I didn't go home to the governor's mansion. I stayed in town. I had a mission that went far beyond just helping Julia, because her story wasn't unique. It was common, too common. Single mothers like Julia were being dragged through the mud of a broken system, while the world turned a blind eye, and I had the power to do something about it. Over the next several weeks, I quietly launched a pilot program under the Radar Project Bridge. It was a coordinated effort across agencies and private organizations that provided wraparound support to struggling single parents. We started with just 10 women. Julia was the first. She helped design the intake process. She gave feedback on the parenting classes, the childcare models, even the job placement systems. She didn't just benefit from the program, she shaped it. Within 3 months, Julia was speaking at community centers. 6 months later, she was on local panels. A year in, she was heading up the entire regional outreach division of Project Bridge. And the ones who once called her a failure, they watched her walk into rooms filled with applause, including our parents. It was a Sunday morning when Julia finally invited them to come visit her apartment. They arrived cautiously carrying a casserole and the same old air of judgment. But they left that day, changed. Not just because of how well Julia was doing, but because of what they learned. She told them about the nights she cried alone while feeding her baby formula with coins she scraped from the car floor. She told them about how I had shown up not with pity, but with a plan. She told them, I never asked for anything in return. When I visited a week later, Mom hugged me on the porch, something she hadn't done in years. I'm sorry, Becca, she whispered. We thought you turned your back on us, but you were just walking the long road home. Dad didn't say much, but I noticed the framed newspaper clipping on his wall. Governor's sister leads statewide reform for single mothers. It wasn't a trophy, but it was something. And as for Travis, well, it didn't take long before karma found him too. Turns out, when you dig into a man's motives, you tend to uncover more than just selfish intent. An anonymous tip led the Department of Child Services to discover Travis had manipulated paperwork and misrepresented Julia's living conditions in his initial custody request. His credibility tanked. He was fined, removed from multiple volunteer organizations, and lost primary visitation for 6 months pending a review. He moved 2 towns over. People didn't forget. Julia never gloated. She said, I don't need him to fall. I just need to stand. And stand she did. One night, months after the trial, we sat on her little back porch, the summer breeze, carrying the smell of fresh laundry. You could have let them suffer, she said quietly. You could have let me suffer. After how everyone treated you. I took a sip of tea and looked out at the night sky. I didn't want revenge, I said. I wanted repair. Still, she said, they all said you failed. And now look. I smiled. I didn't come back to prove them wrong. I came back to be right for someone. We sat in silence for a long time. Stars above us. Crickets in the distance. And in the nursery behind us, her baby sleeping soundly in a world that just maybe was beginning to change. It was Julia's daughter's 3rd birthday when the whole family gathered again under one roof. The house was full of laughter, pink balloons tied to the chairs, and a half-melted unicorn cake on the counter. Kids ran wild in the backyard, while the adults lingered in the kitchen sipping lemonade and swapping stories. I stood in the corner for a while, just watching. Mom was helping Julia wrap leftovers. Dad was attempting to set up a kiddie tent outside. And Julia, she was glowing. She looked tired, but proud, worn, but radiant, like a woman who had walked through the fire and come out shining. I hadn't seen our family this whole in years. Julia caught my eye across the room. She walked over and handed me a tiny party favor with a grin. You know, she said, I used to think you left because you didn't care. I nodded slowly. I know. She looked down, then back up at me, her voice cracked. But I was wrong. You left because you did care, more than any of us ever understood. I reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear just like I used to when we were little. "I didn't leave to escape you, Jules," I whispered. "I left to become the kind of person who could come back and make sure you never had to feel alone again." Tears welled in her eyes. She pulled me into a hug, and for the first time in a long time, the past didn't feel like a weight we carried. It felt like a story we survived. As the sun set behind us, I glanced out the window where her daughter was chasing butterflies barefoot. Maybe that was the real victory, not the court ruling or the applause, but that little girl growing up in a world her mother and aunt rebuilt from the ground up.